All right, folks, welcome to monitoring.sydney. Let me get on with initial intro. So welcome to Monitoring Sydney, which is a meetup about sharing best practices and newest developments in monitoring and observability. This meetup is a joint effort of volunteers from Sydney DevOps community. This meetup operates under a code of conduct. In short, it aims to be a safe and welcoming space for everyone, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, or religion. Thank you all for making this a welcoming and friendly event for all. If you have any concerns, feel free to raise them with organizers in Slack or use the email shown on the screen. So we're also always looking for community speakers. If you have an idea for a talk, please feel free to contact us on organizers@monitoring.sydney at any time. You're very welcome. And today I want to announce our special guest, Erwin, who is a founder and CEO at Linc.sh. And later we have a very special panel with two additional guests joining, Caterina Curti, who does observability at Atlassian, and Jamie Wilkinson, who is an SRE at Google working on customer reliability. We're having very small technical difficulties at the moment, so let's see if we can resolve them shortly. In the meantime, let me just switch the. All right, let me switch one thing. Here we go. Erwin, you should have voice.
Yeah. Okay, need to go here? Right, yep. Can people hear me? All right, cool. Does that work?
It does.
All right. Cool. Sorry about the technical difficulties. About that. But yeah, today I want to sort of share sort of a very interesting story about. Seriously. So what I wanted to share today is a story around a production sort of outage that we had a while ago. And I think it's an amazing example of sort of how observability sort of helped us sort of solve this particular one. And so basically what I'll be doing is a sort of blow account of how I solved a rather obscure sort of production bug. And before we sort of get into that, I need to sort of give you a little bit of context as for what Linc is and what Linc does. Basically, what Linc is, it's a front-end CI/CD pipeline as a product. So basically, what we do is we host every single commit that people make to their front ends, no matter the front-end applications that they have. So whether it's a statically hosted site or whether it's fully server-side rendered. And certainly that last one means that one of the challenges that we have is that we run other people's JavaScript, which is exactly as bad as it sounds, sort of at times. And that's some of the challenges that we're having, is that the most important one, that errors on our platform don't necessarily are ours. They're most often our sort of our customers. And it's very hard to distinguish between sort of the two of them. But yeah, a couple months ago, I think it was sort of February, certainly before sort of the shit hit the fan properly, But yeah, once upon a time, one of our important customers sent me a text going, "Hey, Erwin, something's up with Linc. Preview links work fine for Lachlan and Tim, but not Kathy." I just go, "That's weird, right? Like, how does it work for some people but not for others?" So you look at your dashboards, and the dashboards are fine. We have slightly less 500s on our rendering infrastructure, and I don't know. It all looks good, and even like most of those 500s are not ours; they're our customers, right? So now we're stuck. So I do some testing. I test it out myself. It doesn't work. And sort of like the first aha that I get is this is a quote from Charity Majors, who I'm sure I'll be quoting a lot for the rest of this set of meetup. Nines don't matter if your users aren't happy. And sort of aha number 2 here is that this is a very interesting class of problems, right? We have a low amount of errors, but they are extremely concentrated into a particular customer segment. This particular one is even down to the individual user. It's not just individual, like a region or sort of a customer segment or anything. Like we are now down for 100%. Like we're down 100% for a few users. And that's like an interesting class of problems to sort of solve. Sorry? So I do a little bit of digging, and I very quickly realized we have 3 problems. We have the analytics code crashing if our analytics cookie isn't set on the response. But because it's sent after the response is, because it's executed after the response is sent, like we don't send a 500 on that HTML response. But what happens, because there's a persistence TCP connection open to the process manager, so our failover doesn't kick in for that particular connection. So all the subsequent requests for static assets fail. But more importantly, why the hell is the analytics cookie not set? Right? So solving the analytics code crash was easy, but now I'm stuck with the dilemma as to why isn't the analytic cookie set on some responses, but not on others? Or is it? So the first thing that I do is sort of call in the cavalry. And I have to do a shout out to sort of Honeycomb here, because that's what we are using as sort of our observability tool sort of thing that we use. And basically, it's a very sort of SQL-y interface that you can do. And basically, we store all of our events. So every HTTP request, every Lambda invocation, sort of everything that sort of happens in Linc sort of goes in here. And we can now do like requests on everything. So the first thing that I do is sort of give me a count where response.headers.setCookie does not contain GUID, and group those by root.sitename. And what this does is what it will give me is on which sort of responses do we not set this cookie by sort of sitename. And it turns out it's indeed important customer, but it's also another customer of ours, like that we see a few sort of hits. So we now know that it's relatively contained to these 2 customers, and they see very few errors, but they see a bunch, right? So that's sort of where we sort of get to. And the next thing is sort of looking at the code, going through it, and basically come across this line. If the content type is instead of text.html, set the cookie, right? So then my next question becomes, what is the content type then? So what we can now do is like doing a clause of where the response header.setCookie does not contain GUID, group by response header to the content type. And this comes back. And that's sort of when it sort of hit me, right? Like in a recent upgrade, one of the frameworks, Linc.sh, decided to add the character type to it, which is perfectly fine. But as you remember, we do the check, like, is it equals to, which is obviously sort of doesn't work. So that was the, let me see if I can stop sharing my Does it still work? Can I? Is it still work? Oh, I'll assume. Yeah. This is sort of what I was trying to get to. And this is sort of, because that's what I needed the slides for, is to show you sort of what the problem was. But the thing I wanted to talk about is this was a non-event, right? This was a non-event, and the reason it was a non-event, because like very quickly, the thing is like, does it contain text.html? And we fixed the code. And it took us a grand total of 4 minutes to figure out what's going on, find it, and fix it. Which doesn't sound like a very interesting story until you start to realize, like, what would we have had to do if what would we have to do if we didn't have something like Honeycomb, if we didn't have observability? We would have had to grab through megabytes of logs, trying to locate the events that we're interested in, and sort of piece together. Obviously, we wouldn't have been logging the content type, so we now needed to have added the logging to our code to then sort of see what it is and trying to reproduce it. And it would have been a major event. And that's, for me, what observability is. It's that, can you understand what your system is doing, looking at it from the outside, right? That's not just what it means for me, it's the textbook definition of observability. But that's what it's all about. Like, can you ask and that's what it allows you to do, is it allows you to ask questions about your system that's running, without having to have come up with these questions beforehand. So we didn't have to make a metric on a dashboard. We didn't have to sort of instrument our code and log all of this out to sort of text files. We just take the entire HTTP request and chuck it off to our observability system. And that's where sort of the power comes in, where you have this ability to look into the system and see what's going on. We use it a lot for post deployment. Like, if I push a change up, I will now log into Honeycomb and click around and see whether the change that I was trying to effect actually happens. Yeah. So after I fixed this particular problem, I then refreshed my page a couple times to see if the cookie now was set. So I could now graph the requests over time and see that there was none before, and now sort of we see multiple requests for this particular site that now have their cookie set. And that, for me, is the groundbreaking, massive difference that observability gives you over traditional logging and traditional monitoring. Not to say that these are sort of bad. We do use both of those sort of options sort of whenever they're useful. But yeah, this sort of observability, this ability to grep through and query over any sort of metric. And that's the most powerful thing. One of the things that I talk about, sort of those high cardinality searches. I can now, with a tool like Honeycomb, I can now query all the events for a particular IP address, or for a particular username, or sort of request ID. I can if I get an error log, I can go and look at that particular request ID. And that's basically all I had to say for my presentation. Is this really non-event outage that we're able to solve very, very quickly, having tooling in place that allowed us to sort of cut up our events in really, really any dimension that we want to. Does that make sense? Does people have any sort of questions about sort of what happens and what we do?
I think with the questions, we'll have them set up for the panel. We currently have a person monitoring the chat for additional questions. So if there are any, Rob, let us know. But thank you very much for giving that example. That has been a great preso. And
yeah, sorry about the technical side of things, but
no worries.
But yeah, it's that's sort of what for me is that like the crux of it is we now find the cause of most of our errors in less than 10 minutes. It's usually less than 5. Like we're two or three queries, and we go like, surely, no, it's true.
All right. In this case, let me see and get others to join, and then we'll start with panel questions. Jamie, Caterina, can I get you to enable sound and video?
G'day.
Hey.
All right. Thank you both very much for joining. Caterina, can you just say something so we can test your sound?
Hello.
Fantastic. So I will begin to... Let me switch the view. Let me begin with the first question to the panel. First, can you introduce yourself? So, like, who are you? Like, where are you from? Except for, like, Erwin, I guess. And why what drives your interest in observability?
Okay, I'll go first.
Not all at the same time.
Hi, everybody. I'm Caterina. I've been at Atlassian for the past 5 years, but I actually only joined the observability team 3 months ago, which means like my view on observability is very, very fresh. My role at Atlassian is a shield. I don't think anybody understands what a shield is, so I'll give you some context. I'm the conduit between our observability team and the users, which means I'm always listening to the needs of our users, and at the same time, I help them work with observability at Atlassian. So every time they are considering adding a new metric, or a new metric is not flowing in, or they need some help with some charts, they reach out to me. At the same time, I also talk to our vendors. So I partially do vendor management from a team point of view. What drives me to observability? I think I only have a funny answer on this, which is I love charts. I still remember when in my previous job, we didn't have any observability tooling, and I had to go through debug logs manually. And at that time, I was studying R. So I created some R programs to chart the logs.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. Jamie, can I get you to share a couple of words about yourself?
Sure. My name's Jamie, and I've been at Google now for almost 13 years. In fact, I'm not even sure that's correct. I've lost track. So I've been a sysadmin for almost 20 years now. And as a sysadmin, I've really enjoyed the experience of having, I guess, the precursor to observability tools around to help debugging. And certainly I've got, I'm a big fan of graphics as well. So being able to plot things on a chart is the first time I saw that with Nagios was, in fact, not Nagios, with Cacti, was really eye-opening. And, you know, there's this whole world of possibilities available now. And then as the industry has progressed, we've realized that the more and more data you try and throw into a monitoring system, the worse they get. And I guess now I'm really excited about what companies like Honeycomb offer us, where you don't have to think too hard about how you want to view the data yet, but you know that you want to stick it all in there so that you can query it once you know what the right precedent is.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Really exciting.
That's what I love about the example. It's such a trivial example, but yeah, content like just chucking all of everything in there, and it was 2 years later that I go like, but what about the content type thing? Yeah, definitely.
Jamie, thanks for the intro. And Erwin, I would leave the last to you. You've already shared a bit about who you are and where you're from, but can you tell us like what drove your like original effort to dive into observability?
Yeah, so I've been following charity majors on Twitter for a long time, which I can definitely encourage everyone to do. As a CEO and CTO who is somewhat sort of less polished than some of the other ones. But yeah, she had really strong opinions on sort of this stuff, and then she sort of left Facebook to build this startup, Honeycomb, and I got sort of interested in it. And one of the things I love to do is look at new tech and figure out what's possible. And yeah, so when I started sort of diving into sort of what they were trying to solve, I'm like, well, surely that's not possible. So I got talking to them, and turned out it was possible. And that's for me, like having that amount of like insight into your running code, because like code's getting more and more complex, right? We now have like we're a startup. We sort of pretty small, but even then, like we have now dozens of lambdas running, like different kinds of lambdas. We got a couple thousand running sort of at any one time. There's some Docker containers. There's a sort of static, like there's so much moving parts that you can never fully grasp sort of what's going on. But yeah, for me to have that ability to just go and pinpoint like what's that thing over there, what's that doing, is sort of what drove me to sort of implement it.
Thanks for that insight. So using that as a bit of a segue, I wanted to ask you all, how do you get people to care about investing in monitoring, observability, in just even in general telemetry, because not everyone is like at a later stages of of an observable stack. So how do you like quote unquote sell it to either your boss or your peers, or like your dependent teams, for example? Since Caterina has said that she has like quite a bit of experience on like pushing through,
I would imagine her answer is better than mine. Yeah.
Yeah, I would start with Caterina, but you're all welcome to chime in, because I think this would start an interesting discussion.
Yeah, so I think this is a very interesting question, but my answer is maybe going to disappoint you because I don't really have an answer on this. So for developers, managers, every team at Atlassian, this is not an option. Like doing observability is not an option. Like you have to do it. And if you don't do it, somebody, like I don't even know who, will come and find you. So maybe like to try to answer your question, maybe we have a good leader, like maybe the owner of responsibility of observability at Atlassian is a good manager and he achieved that. I'm not sure. I cannot really tell you like if users understand how important that is. What I can tell you for sure is that I know that the developers they don't want to spend their time to set up what's related to observability. So they don't see that as their core job. From their point of view, they want to be like it doesn't mean they don't care about that, but they want that to be as fast as possible. If they have to choose between like writing some code and setting up some dashboards, they want to write the code.
I guess executive sponsorship definitely helps with that, and I think that the situation you described means that you have like a strong, like good, like sponsorship on the idea. But Jamie, what about Google? Especially since you've been there for a while, and maybe like the early days were a little bit more Wild West than the current situation.
I think we see a very similar pattern of behavior, but Google's now got the advantage that over time, this big substrate of infrastructure code exists now, and it does everything you need, so you don't have to think about writing it yourself. So take, for example, gRPC and its precursor inside and protobufers. They came to exist because someone realized that if we just made the whole platform look the same, that it's really easy to use, easy to program against, and all of these different servers can start communicating with each other really easily. And then once everyone starts to use that, then you can instrument that little piece of code, and suddenly that's a huge multiplier effect for the rest of the company. So if all the RPC code is already instrumented, you don't really have to think about it yourself. And then that goes into a big monitoring system, and then like now you're typing a query into the monitoring system for the code you just wrote, and you haven't really done any other work. And I think that's what Caterina was saying, where the developers want the feature to exist, but they don't want to have to do the work. So if
Yeah,
you have the that common substrate that you're building on, like your I can't think of the right word for it, but your company has built like this core library that everyone then uses, and then you get that advantage. Sorry, go on.
yeah. And I think like following up on this, this is also the mission of a dedicated observability team in a company. So it is to make it as easy as possible and as cheap as possible for the users to use it.
Yeah, and that's like I definitely sort of agree with that. I find the best way to sort of get started with some of the other companies that have been sort of helping set this up is just show how incredibly easy it is to get started, and like just starting out and ingesting like your HTTP requests into the free tier of Honeycomb, right? I know I don't actually have any Honeycomb shares. I should totally get some. But like they've got a free tier, doesn't cost you anything. Like just do your like the entry point of your HTTP requests. Right? You can spend like weeks implementing full traceability, where you do traces from your entry point all the way to your backend calls and back and blah. And like that's a lot of work. But just starting really simple with like your HTTP requests in your entry point, you have all the HTTP requests. Like you now know what goes in and out of your system. Like it's not a binary, either I have observability or I don't. It's the like it's trade-offs.
You've reminded me of another tool for convincing people to start adopting this. At Google, again, we've got many teams, and if one team can demonstrate that their ability to respond to an incident is much better than others, then people will be asking, oh, what do they have that we don't? And if observability is that thing, then that's going to drive a lot. So I like your 4-minute example so much, because I can imagine that outage having consumed hours or days worth of engineering time, right? Without that technology. So you can show people, it's like your outage has taken several days to figure out what the cause was, but had you done it this way, and here's a case study where Linc has done a similar looking kind of bug, but they managed to solve it in 4 minutes, then that's very powerful, right? And I think you're absolutely right that the way to start is not to try and solve everything all at once, but use postmortems and post-incident reviews to help drive where you want to improve your observability over time. If you just start with the very boundaries of the application, that gives you a starting point, right? And then
that gives you
go, well, if only we knew how long these requests were taking in each of these backends, maybe that's something we want to do. So you add that code, you start doing tracing, and then you've just gradually build up this profile. And over time, you get more and more information. But you don't, like you say, you don't need that to start.
No.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Caterina.
Yeah, I think you just raised another interesting point, which is something that is in my long-term vision for the team, which is build a community around observability within the company. So because if the observability team owns this for everybody, we will need so many employees in such a short time, while developers, they know better than we do which metrics they need. We can provide the infrastructure, we can make it easy for them, but they know the problem space more than we do.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Sort of indeed, once you get beyond the sort of infrastructure, type level, like HTTP requests and everything, you also want much more domain type information in those events that you sort of send out, and that's you need developers to sort of care about it and add that type of information to there as well. In my example, it's the site name, right? The site name is not part of the sort of the URLs or anything else. So, but it's something that sort of one of the developers, one of us, sort of added into that event that we could now sort of query by it. So yeah, you need to have that developer input. But it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem to sort of get back to your original question. Is you need to have it to appreciate just how incredibly powerful it is. But yeah, you need to understand how powerful it is to install it. Once you're sort of have that really low barrier start, you can start to solve some problems. And the next step then question then becomes is well, why don't we put more in there rather than so yeah, starts really small, start really simple.
Caterina, I think you touched on a very important topic about starting a community inside the company around monitoring and drive a culture of monitoring and observability in a company. Do you have any advice for other people to how to start a community inside a company? Are there any things that you can do to do so?
So let me tell you what I did so far. So the easy example is somebody comes to me asking for an example. I give them a link to a repo, to a Git repo, and I tell them go and check it there. Maybe it's there. Or if it's not there and you build something, add it there. And this is based on the assumption that a lot can be done as config as code, right? So that means there is a single place, it's a Git repository, so the developers are already used to work in that area, and they are already used to collaborate on that. Does this make sense? The second example that I have is you probably know that we run Ship It. So Ship It is our 24 hours of innovation. You can build whatever you want. Like nothing is going to tell you what to build. Like you come up with your idea and then you get a team like joining you, or you go solo as you want. So after I joined, we had one Ship It, and all the tickets that are related to Ship It are public, so everybody in the company can see them. I went through each one of them and searched for the ones that were observability related, and I ran the unofficial observability Ship It. So I took all the ones that were related, asked my team to vote for them, and then we got a winner, and then we wrote a blog post and shared that with everybody in the company.
All right. Thanks for sharing your experience. So I wanted to give voice to our audience for 1 second, and I see that there is a question in the chat. So I think, Jamie, it was prompted because you mentioned working with tools like Koogh and Nagios. So in your opinion, folks, do you think there's still a place for the like old guard of observability tools? Like in your personal opinion, should anyone still be using Koogh or Nagios?
I think I could talk for an hour on this topic. So I'm going to let the other two go first.
It's sort of yes and sort of no. Like it's there's not sort of a yes and no answer. And like things like host-based monitoring is useless for me, right? Because I don't run any host anymore. We run our stuff on AWS, and like we use sort of Fargate and ECS and Docker containers. And if something dies, they spin one up, and if it dies again, they spin up another one, and sort of Lambda. So like from that sort of host-based monitoring, and like that's sort of less useful to us. But we still have alerts on, like there's a bunch of 500s coming from our CDN. Like someone should probably have a look into this, right? So like I think that's sort of where we like monitoring is still a useful thing. Like our error rate's going up. I still want to know that.
Yeah, so I don't have much experience, so I'm probably not the most qualified person to answer this. But I think as a follow-up, what I can say is as long as everything flows into one single place, like don't start having, like 10 places when you need to go and look for your alarm. Like as much as you can, centralize that.
I don't need to say anything now. I've been neatly summarized, but I will. I was thinking about this during when the story before about not having to rewrite the code and add the metrics because you knew what the question was to ask beforehand. And it reminded me of when I first discovered Borgmon inside of Google, which you probably you might have experience as Prometheus, which looks very similar to how Borgmon works. When I first discovered that, my mind was blown open, and I immediately thought that Nagios was the worst thing in the world, and Borgmon was the best thing ever. And I still feel like that's kind of true. But it took me a long while to realize that the things that Nagios does, where you just send a check from the system, from outside the system, is still incredibly valuable. Borgmon relies on you being able to instrument the inside of the code and export that. So you do have to know what the things that you want to export are first, which is great if you know that they're error rates, but not great if you are trying to ask questions about like what was the content type.
Yeah.
This particular thing. So there is a place in the world for things that look like what Nagios did, and I don't mean the host-based monitoring stuff, because the configuration for that program was so terrible that it basically made it unmaintainable. But the check script is incredibly valuable, and I know Honeycomb still today has their Hello World equivalent, which is I wrote a script that fetches a page and then tests the values and how long did it take and what content is in
Yeah,
it.
of course
so
I do. Yeah.
And then send that into Honeycomb, right? Inside Google, we call that a prober, and its job is literally just to fetch the page and test things that's still true. And that's what Nagios used to do. And I agree with Caterina that you got to stick all of that information straight into the same monitoring system. So likewise with events, you still need to be able to write, like, plot a graph of the error rates, and inside Google we call these SLIs. So you still want to be able to have that, so you can build like a very high level understanding of whether the system is performing to your expectations, but then being able to ask questions you don't know what the questions are yet is still very important. So I see it as there's two halves. One of them is monitoring the system to know that it is doing what you expected it to do, and the second half is troubleshooting it when it is not doing that anymore. And so observability helps a lot with
why? Yeah.
I got a segue into when I first heard the word observability. I was like, in the olden days, we called it debugging. And I was like, get off my lawn. I don't feel like that anymore. I feel like it's a good word.
It's
but you got to understand, like, the
observability is helping you debug, right?
Yeah, it's helping you debug, right? In the olden days, you had GDB and a single process on a machine on a lamp stack, and you'd go, I can literally attach myself to the entire process. I don't have to instrument my code with tracing code, because I can set breakpoints and look at the RAM on the machine and see what actually is happening. And we don't have that luxury anymore with cloud computing. So you have to basically embed parts of the debugger in your code and then ship it off somewhere else, and then you can ask the questions that you would with a debugger in a different language, a different system, right? So I feel like there's lots of parallels, but because of the topology of the system are different, we have to do it differently. But you've got to understand that the two halves are basically, is the system functioning as intended, and when it's not, can I figure out why? And so that's
a great
why
way of phrasing it. Yeah,
there's still still a place for things like Nagios and Cacti in this world.
All right. Thanks for sharing your experience. It was actually pretty cool. So one additional question that I wanted to ask you all is, what are some of the challenges you've encountered with pushing for observability in your organization? And if you can, of course, like give like an example of how you overcome them.
I can go first.
Yeah.
Like even, yeah.
No, yeah. I was going to say you go first because that's what you do.
Yeah. So even if, as I told you, it's a given that everybody must do observability, I can tell you that for sure something that we are seeing at the stage where we are right now is the scale. So my role wouldn't exist if the scale of the usage of observability was as big as it is right now. The other part is like a huge challenge for us, and probably for you as well, is PII, UGC. How do we filter them? Because we have a very open culture, so everybody can see every metric, every log, every tracing information, which means we cannot afford to have any UGC or PII in those. How do we make sure that that doesn't happen, and that we have strategies in place to act when that happens? Going back for 1 second to the scale issue, so far we are pretty much not doing any filtering. So if Confluence or Jira decide to start sending us twice as much logs as they are doing today, in 10 minutes, we will get them. And same with metrics, and that can be like a huge problem. because we need an infrastructure to support that. But we are not protecting ourselves against that.
Yes.
So still on the topic of scale, we cannot do everything on our own. So we rely on vendors, and that can be very costly, not the vendors on their own, but the scale at which we operate for both the size of our team. So I'm a cost, if you want to take it in that way, but also the vendor is a cost, and depending on how much data you are shipping, the cost increases.
Yeah, definitely. And that's definitely a concern I see a lot, because obviously being the CEO of a startup makes it really easy for me to convince everyone else to do it. Certainly, as I wrote the tools to do it. But yeah, I spend a lot of time trying to sort of get other companies to adopt this, like the industry wide. And yeah, there's a couple perceptions. There's the perceptions that it's expensive to implement. It's hard to implement, takes a lot of time, but also expensive to sort of host and run. It's sort of the two things that I sort of come across sort of a lot. And I'm like, well, we don't have the time to implement this. And you're like, well, but it's literally 2 hours to get some insights, not all your insights, but to get a bunch of insights is 2 hours of work. Yeah, so a lot of the time I just sort of go in, sort of friends, and sort of go well, can you come in and do this? I'm like, sure. So, and I think you mentioned before, sort of Caterina, sort of ship it. Let's just go do it. And that's where I think the most valuable thing to do is if you're interested in this stuff, if you want to play with it, just do it. Go find a place where you ingest logs. Putting in your CloudFront logs into something like Honeycomb is sort of interesting. It gives you insights, and it takes you an hour. Getting some HTTP server instrumented to send stuff is another couple hours, right? So start really slow and just do it. Just go and do it. You need to be I agree, Caterina, that the personal identifiable information is sort of a thing we have to be a bit wary about. But find a place where that isn't an issue, and just chuck it in there, and start using it and start playing with it. It's the most important thing. The barrier to entry is really low. Start using it, start playing with it, see what it gives you.
So you say lead by example, right?
Yep. Just go and sort of do it. Even if people are sort of really worried about shipping sort of logs off-site, I'm even a Grafana and a thing locally will get you a lot of the way there.
All right. Jamie, do you have any stories to tell on this particular topic? Jamie? Australian internet is a notorious thing, so let's give him a couple of minutes to join back. In the meantime, I wanted to ask another question. Oh, here we go.
Hi.
Hello.
Welcome back.
My tab just froze.
Yeah, no worries. So I was wondering, do you have any stories on this particular topic on trying to push observability and any challenges and how you overcame them?
With some of our customers, we had a similar experience with Erwin, where they want the final product but don't want to put any of the effort in. And then it's just a case of trying to convince them that it is only a couple of minutes, maybe a couple of hours work to do the first pass, and the ongoing improvement is just part of the same continuous improvement you have going on anyway. And then there's also the question about cost and scale. and I know people are concerned about this a lot. I feel like, and I don't have a lot of experience here, but I feel like vendors solve this problem for you, so you don't have to. And that slides into my other thought, which is the only place I've seen that actually has a problem with the amount of data that's going on is at Google, where I do see people go, oh, I don't really want to use the tracing system because it's slow and they don't really want us to send them a lot of data. And I think that's a problem that most people don't have and are unlikely to encounter.
Yeah, exactly. Like most, we do sizable amount of traffic, not Atlassian or even Google size, but we just chuck all the events in there because why bother? But like this is sort of the thing where Charity's been talking about for a long time is sort of dynamic sampling. And like, do I really need every 200 to go into my observability system? And I'm like, no, I don't. Right? Like, and I'm sure that's the stuff that Atlassian's looking in right now. I'm like, do we really need all of our 200s? I'm like, no, we don't. Do we need all of our 500s? I'm like, probably, yeah. And then it becomes interesting, right? Like, how can we intelligently sort of drop traffic, and what do we drop and what do we not drop? So like, even if you get to that point, and like, there's techniques and there's solutions out there to help you manage that sort of cost base.
Yeah, I think there is also a cultural topic around this, which is developers will expect to be able to use the observability tools for debugging in the cloud or microservices world. So they will expect to have every single trace in there, every single metric, and that's something that I have to explain to them. Like, no, like we cannot afford that. So you need a different tool for that, which can still be part of observability, but it's not your metric system. It's not your tracing system.
Well, and I think that's also like it gets interesting, right? If they can change sort of what is and isn't sampled, it's up to them to make sure that it's sampled correctly, right? And that's where I think it's one of those things where again, a Charity quote around this, where the traditionally DevOps has been very much about getting dev into ops, but like this requires devs to be a lot more ops, and that's sort of where I sort of find interesting is sort of like devs now need to be much more aware of sort of what ops is and where ops is going and what it's doing and what's going on in that world. And it's extremely powerful when you sort of merge those two. Sort of very well.
One thing, Caterina, that you mentioned, I think is a good segue into one of our chat questions in here. So you said that, observability, it's not your traces, it's not your logs. Do you have any good analogies to differentiate between like what like monitoring is and what like observability is, to make it maybe like more approachable to some people?
I will go last on this one.
That's fair. Jamie, Erwin, do you folks want to chime in?
Jamie, go first.
Can you repeat the question, please?
So the question is do you have any good analogies to differentiate between like the concept of monitoring and the concept of observability?
I think I covered that before. Monitoring is you already know the questions you want to ask, and you want to test, like specifically for our systems, you want to make sure the system is fit for purpose. So I've got my requirements and I'm testing those requirements continually and letting operators or developers know if it fails to meet that. And observability is being able to debug a system where you don't yet know what it is you want to ask. So there's a lot more flexibility in observability. I think we've just touched on this whole idea that it isn't free. There's a whole lot of trade-offs that need to be considered once you get to a point where, like Atlassian is, where you can't afford to store everything. And then you need to start making trade-offs about what it is you store. And I think Erwin is spot on where you say there are certain types of responses that are more valuable than others. And once you help developers make those decisions as they're writing the code, then they can be more informed about what it is we think is going to help. And I guess it starts to really blur the lines, because if you start to do this, then you kind of have to know the kinds of questions you're going to ask in the future. And it's very vague, but this is not a problem that most people are going to face. So I want to stress that these are not the optimizations you're looking for just yet.
Very true. Very true. Yeah. Yeah, I don't really have good analogies that I use. But yeah, like the difference is whenever I explain monitoring versus observability, it's exactly what sort of Jamie's talking about. Monitoring is, does it do what it should be doing? And observability is useful when it doesn't, in trying to figure out sort of what the hell's going on.
Caterina, any comments to add?
So I think the only comment is that from our point of view, logging is still part of observability. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm not sure if you're actually like taking this in any different way.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I meant more in terms of you saying that, observability is not only logging or like only monitoring. It's like a more kind of difficult concept. So there's another question in here from the chat is, has anyone had experience of trying to put observability into legacy systems and kind of like backport some of the like newer concepts into those?
Well, I can go with the sort of least legacy sort of systems, because it's a bit weird when we talk about our legacy systems. They're sort of Docker containers running on sort of Fargate. But yeah, we have code that just was never instrumented, and like a lot of it that sort of Jamie touched on sort of earlier as well is both of Jamie and Caterina. It was sort of around like there's so much you can do at like the infrastructure layer, sort of that you don't even need to touch, or hardly need to touch any of the code. And that's a lot of what sort of I do when faced with these problems. It's sort of start at the outside, like even outside of the system, and then the entry point, like, and then sprinkle in sort of as you go along, like sprinkle in the rest of the information that you want out of there. But there's so much stuff you can do from either outside or the entry point into your program.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it. I'm done.
And keep in mind that this is not just like about legacy systems. You may be running a third-party software. So how do you add your observability concepts on those? Because you don't want to exclude them from your observability world. Like you want to know what's happening there. So I think what Erwin just said about you can even just have like a proxy in front of them and start with the host metrics and the proxy metrics. It's already a great way to introduce that.
Hard agree. I used to work on our LDAP infrastructure, and in that team we were responsible for Open LDAP and Bind and DHCPD, the ISC DHCP server, and these were all open source, off-the-shelf things, and we're trying to integrate them with Borgmon, which is at the time an in-house solution with its own metrics, and you had things like Open LDAP where you can say, if I construct the right LDAP query, it will dump out a tree of the LDAP schema with all the server metrics in it. So we had to write some code that ran this query every so often and then transformed that into the metrics format that Borgmon would like. MySQL does the same. You go MySQL admin, give me the stats, and it goes, here's the number of connections open, here's how long they're taking, the slow queries and that kind of stuff. And then we did other cool stuff like the logs are rich sources of information. So you crank up the debug level and then you just run things that tail them and pull out things that look interesting. And again, count up the number of times that a connection reset occurs in SSHD, for example. Then you go, well, that was unexpected. So maybe we've got some problems going on there. So you kind of look for these signals. Every time you have an outage, you go, well, that was kind of weird. How do we detect this problem from occurring in the future? And then slowly you build up these ridiculously large regular expression libraries and all this kind of stuff to try and figure out how it is you want to get the internal state out of these third-party applications into your monitoring system. So it's totally possible. And I feel like the same thing applies for observability, and possibly even easier with observability rather than monitoring, because you don't even have to ask, like, is this field in a log line something that's interesting to me yet? You know, I don't know. Well, let's just go.
I don't know.
Yeah, I
Chuck it in
see
there.
the Apache request logs and I go, there was a 200 and it was this many bytes of payload and it took this long, right? And then chuck that in the
Yeah. Apache HTTP logs, like chuck them in there.
Yeah, so
There's cool stuff in there.
Yeah. So if you've got a prober script that's dumping information and that's giving you the full end-to-end performance of the system, and then you go through each of these applications and you stick either a proxy in front of them or you scrape their logs, or you do something really cool like PCAPs or eBPF probes to look at certain parts of the function, parts of the program. All of these things have their costs, of course, but it's possible for you to go and get into what's going on inside of these third-party applications.
Yeah, I have another one for you. So what about synthetic checks? Because this is a topic that I haven't heard that much, like in the observability world, but that would be, from my point of view, an awesome way of monitoring some legacy system or some vendors. So you start synthesizing some load against them and checking if the pages are loading or not.
Yeah, I think you've got to. With legacy systems where you can't modify the code at all, you've got to. I'm grouping legacy and things I can't modify together. But let's say I bought Oracle, right? I'm gonna create a thing that sends Oracle connection setup, logs in, does a count number of fields thing, and disconnects. And maybe I run that every 5 minutes, and that way I know at least the Oracle database is still running. In practice, I would never actually use Oracle, so this is just a completely hypothetical example. But you get the idea, right? Like every one of your applications that you depend on can be queried because you wrote a program that is querying them, or you've written a program that's querying a program that's querying. Like there's just RPCs going on all the way down the chain. Whether they look like a gRPC or they don't, like an ODBC call or something else, you can instrument somewhere along this chain. And if I set up a PCAP filter or an eBPF filter that looks for requests coming into a particular port and then counting bytes and then writing that somewhere, I mean, that's really, maybe you're can't think of the right word, sorry. There's a kind of an esoteric.
And it seems we have another case of Australian internet. Sorry, folks. Let's just give Jamie another 5 seconds to rejoin.
For
all right.
Nope.
No worries. Let's just see. Hey, Jamie, are you with us?
I am. I don't know.
Beautiful.
That's
all right.
I need more observability into my current tab.
But I think you I think you were at the end of a sentence when you disconnected.
What was the last thing I said?
Esoteric. That was the last word.
Oh, okay. I keep throwing around this packet capture idea because it was one thing we used. We were trying to monitor DNS, and that's a UDP-based thing. So trying to get traffic levels out of bind resulted in us writing a PCAP program that ran alongside it. I think it was pretty cool.
Not ideal, but if it's the last thing to do, you do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was going somewhere with that, and I've kind of forgotten what it was because of the connection resetting. Oh dear.
It was the whole sort of like there's so much stuff you can do from outside the application, even if you can't instrument the inside of your application.
Right.
Was the point you're making, and like
Yeah,
there are trade-offs, right? It's like if you can instrument the application, it's probably sort of it could be easier to do. But for a lot of the stuff, like a lot of the low-hanging fruit is where you don't even have to change the application. You just ingest logs straight away.
Yeah.
I think the part of the thought is also if there is a will, there is a way type of approach.
Very, very much. Yeah. Jamie seems to be a massive advocate of that sort of philosophy.
I started so over 10 years ago at Google. The systems weren't as polished as they are today. So you basically had to hack up some scripts to get information out of these things. Like a lot of these systems I'm talking about have been deprecated for a long time now. So the new shinier ones are all well integrated with a monitoring system and people don't have to think too hard about it. But back in the day, we had to try whatever we could to improve our ability to understand what the systems are doing.
So we have another question from the audience. So do analytics have a place in observability, or do you see them as sort of like a different thing to the side that, like, you know, the business folks should be looking at?
I love this is my favorite question. I'm not sure if it's your favorite question too, Caterina. Like once, like it was the thing where when I started using this stuff, like a lot of the questions that we started asking were very like operationally based, right? I've got an outage, let's go fix the outage. But over time, it's become like a large part of our analytics. Like the questions that because I'm this weird hat where I'm both like the CEO, so I've got the sort of operational side, but also the product side of things is a large part of my job. So yeah, I find myself like going to again sort of Honeycomb, like for a lot of the queries, like how many people are doing this, like how many different blahs are there? Are there any people who are using this and this? Because all the information is in there. Honeycomb, if you're listening, I need more granularity on like larger timescales than a couple days. But yeah, like maybe not right now. So right now I still use like an analytics tool, like and sort of Honeycomb, because like some of the technical limitations that sort of Honeycomb has. But I'm definitely looking forward to today where I can turn off my analytics, my dedicated analytics tool, and just have everything in the same spot.
Yes, I have strong opinions usually on so many things, so which is maybe the reason why I'm here. So, so I have 2 points of views. So the first one is do analytics belong to observability within Atlassian? And the answer is no. Like my team doesn't own analytics. So there is a different team owning that. This doesn't mean that's the right or wrong way of doing things. And going more into what I think about that, I'm a big sponsor of make sure you have a very well-defined problem you're solving, and you have a very clear persona that you are solving that for. And with this in mind, I think my opinion is that observability and analytics are not the same thing and shouldn't be mixed up. And now, Erwin, you can reply back on this if you want. You don't have to.
Yeah, I don't like yes and no. I mean, it's like we're at very different scales as well. Again, right? It's like we're not yet at sort of Atlassian scale. It could be different, but sort of like from where we are right now, I think it's it's like having everything in one place, but also what would be and sort of like what would we need to get to this place. I don't think they're going to merge for a while yet. But where I think we're going to is the point where all of the events are going to go into this one store, and we'll have two views on the data that's there, right? So we have the and the points of distinction become the UIs more than the data. Because using like Honeycomb as our sort of product analytics tool is clunky because it's not built for that. So I sort of agree with you in that like they're very different use cases, very different users. But I think the distinction is going to come in the query tools, not so much in the core of the data. And I think that's sort of where we're going to. And because I have a dev background, for me, it's easy to sort of jump into like the observability tool to get the information, because the information's there. It's just like hard to query. Like I cannot do like if I want to have a unique count over a month, which is a very like basic like product analytics question, I can't get that out of Honeycomb because Honeycomb doesn't do that, because it's not useful in a operational sort of time. So, but I think we're getting to the point where, like, because you mentioned it, like storage is like incredibly becomes expensive at scale. So I'm thinking, I think in the next few years, we're going to get to the point where we have the observability system, and we'll have the ops interface, and we'll have the product interface. And those are two very, very different use cases.
Yeah.
So I can do it now, but I'm pretty sure I'm one of the very few people that like will be able to do it. And even I can't do it for everything because the technical capabilities just aren't there to do it.
Yeah, like just to give you a quick follow-up on this. So within observability, my team is called Data Lakes. So do I wish that became a Data Lake singular?
Yeah.
Yes, maybe. Yeah. And from a user point of view, what I think is really missing is the ability to jump across those information, right? I'm starting from the metrics, and now I want to see my logs. And now I want to see my traces. So if there was a tool for doing that, it would help the developers so much to have a bird's eye view around observability and their products and their software.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to ask, that's another question from our audience, is how important would you say log and data normalization is across different sources? And if you do normalize, like adding for myself, if you do normalize that data, do you try to like normalize it at the application level, or do you then kind of like, like store it somewhere and then like run a data pipeline on it to normalize it?
I'm probably sort of much more interested in sort of Jamie's perspective on this than sort of mine.
I don't think I have a good answer. Artem, can you explain what you mean by normalized?
Like, for example, making sure that all the logs have the same exact format, like, that you have like the same exact like timestamp, the same exact like fields, or the fields are at least like compatible between each other, and things like that.
Okay, so making sure they've got a nice schema and you can
exactly
machine readable. I guess the answer is yes, it's really good to do that because it makes a whole bunch of things easier in the future. Regular expressions are really great, but as we all know, they come with their own problems. I like them. I'm a sysadmin with background compilers.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, the less work you have to do at query time, the better for being able to answer queries faster, right? So if you... All right, I'm going to go off on a tangent here because I've just thought of something. There is a project called Nanolog, I think, and it's a C++ library, and it basically says, hey, all these printf calls where you've got your format string and then your parameters, that's really great. We're not going to do that. We're just going to take all the parameters and write them in a structured log format, and then you can do the printfing later if you like. Sorry, I think it's a syslog call, but regardless, there's a format string, and then there's a bunch of parameters that have types, and why would we spend all that time transforming all of these values that have types into a string, only for you to then go stick them in Splunk or whatever and say, yeah, that was a floating point number, so let me extract that string and pass it back into floating point number. And you go, look at all these poor CPUs burning, transforming things from one format into another, and only just to throw that all out and do it again. So, like, why would you do that? So, take all those places where you do a printf call and just go, well, let's just turn that into a structured log format and go, we're done. Store that in a database, and then I can query on, like, I want to know what the timestamp value was and I know what that was because the parameter to the printf string was this timestamp field.
I think you touched on a really sort of important point there. So for me, like, your logs need to be structured, right? If you want to do anything interesting with them beyond tailing them. So, like, from a log perspective, they need to be machine readable. Like, they need to be structured, whether it's a JSON or sort of anything else. Normalization is useful if you want to query over multiple sort of data sets, like sources of information. It's useful, but I wouldn't like, we're now at the point where we have so many different moving parts to our systems that I now run into shit, we called it this there and this here, right? And now we're just going to go and fix it and call them the same thing. But I would definitely worry about the structuring of your logs. Like, I wouldn't worry too much around, like, the normalization of that schema and making sure, like, beyond the basics, right? Like,
I think I agree with that.
Like, pick a timestamp and just, like, deal with it.
I agree with that. I think I'm now thinking of a big table, and if you use anything like Cloud SQL, you say, well, here's two tables, and I want to join these two tables on a common field, and then you can say, okay, well, that system I called the timestamp TS, and that one I called the timestamp nanos or something, and you go, right, now we know how to join those two tables together, write a big SQL query that does the right thing, and then, SQL lets you do stored procedures and so forth, so you can just say, the canonical way to merge these two data sources together is this thing. But I think the critical thing is not being able to compose the query, but being able to have the query execute quickly. And that means I didn't spend any time doing any pre-processing of the data formats.
Yeah. And also, how do you get all the developers working across different teams and products to agree on a common format? It's never going to happen.
Right. And we have no SQL databases now.
Pick your battles, right? Pick the 5 fields where it's crucial, like, and do those 5. But don't come with here's the 250 things you have to standardize on.
Yeah. Or even automate those 5 for them. So
Oh yeah, oh definitely, yeah. The easier you can make that, like the better. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely agree. Yeah, no, it's a great point. Like pick your battles with normalization. Like if you have a handful.
If you've got a machine readable schema, then you will be able to modify whatever you call these things in the future. And so I think optimizing for maintainability or mutability, being able to change what you've got is a better long run than some other alternatives. Like if I just lost my train of
anything else really.
Yeah, like literally anything else. Like optimize for change.
But
if like Caterina said, if the developers are forced to, well, let them call it whatever they like, but also means you can go and change the code in the future and call it something different if you need to.
Yeah, but also like, and that's like what we're running into right now is like it's our problem as devs that these things aren't called the same thing, right? So we now have an incentive to make sure they're the same across the application. So yeah, but also it hasn't been like a problem. But once I can see a time where like 2 or 3 of these things would just go like, no, we should just go and standardize on it.
Right. There's a point in time where like Google's past this point many years ago where standardizing on things has so much better return on investment than not like letting people run faster.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
you'll hit the point in the trade-off curve where
exactly.
It's better to say here's the schema that we use everywhere versus we can just deal with that in post.
Yeah, but as Caterina very correctly sort of mentioned, like you need to be very, very deliberate about what you standardize because it's incredibly hard to do across a large amount of teams.
Right. I think asking the last question for our panel today, this would be another question from our audience. So what observability tools do you use as a part of your stack in your environments? But the main core ones, not like of course like there's maybe quite a bit of like smaller tools, etc. But like what would you say are the cornerstones of your observability experience?
Well, I don't think that's a surprise for me. Like for us, Honeycomb is everything. So everything for us goes into Honeycomb, and that's the only thing we query. Like so, we got not like there's some stuff that goes into CloudWatch, but CloudWatch is never our first point of entry. So we will find an event in Honeycomb, like for a particular Lambda invocation, for example, and that will include the filtered log URL for that particular invocation request in CloudWatch. We will never look into CloudWatch, but occasionally there's stuff in the logs that aren't in Honeycomb. So that, and then we got like Mixpanel for our analytics. Those are the only three tools that we have to sort of figure out what's going on.
So I'm only allowed to share the tools that are public information about Atlassian. So I cannot give you like the full list. So it's no secret that we use Splunk. So my manager, the manager of my manager, gave presentations at SplunkConf in the past years. So if you want to know more about how we use it, there are the recordings around, and I can also share the link with you if there is interest on that. And then, we also use AWS, but I wouldn't call that like part of our observability solution at all. That's a source of observability data.
Google Cloud Operations, formerly known as Stackdriver. At home, I use Prometheus and Zipkin together with a bit of Grafana, I suppose. But yeah, historically, everything from random bits of Python to Borgmon and now the back end of cloud monitoring or Stackdriver. Whatever we call it.
Yeah, I think like an interesting point on this is that we actually also built one ourselves for synthetic checks.
All right.
Yeah.
Thankful. Yep. Sorry.
Yeah, and then I mean, of course, we use Ops Genie and Status Page, which are Atlassian products.
Well done.
All right. So I wanted to thank you all for participating in our panel today. This is really appreciated. I hope that the audience has also enjoyed the answers to their questions and the conversation in general. I would say for more we are planning to hold more events, so do be interested to join in the future. Erwin, thank you so much for being our guest of honor
Thanks
today.
for having us.
We really appreciate it. Caterina, Jamie, thank you so much for joining. And with that, I'll just do some I'll leave you in the channel, but I'll do some notes for the audience on the other screen.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate your
I think this means we can say hi to each other now.
And if you want to join our conversations in Slack,
no, I
please...
think he muted this.
Okay, I'm sorry, the audio is still ongoing. Some technical issues, as this is our first time doing a stream, so apologize for that. We are planning to hold further events, so do be aware of our meetup group and our Twitch here. If you want to join the discussion, feel free to do so at monitoring.sydney. Yes, this is an actual domain, and you can click the Slack or the meetup link at the top. If you're having as I said before, we're always looking for community speakers, so feel free to write at organizers@monitoring.sydney at any time. Thank you very much for joining, and I would also want to extend special thanks to all the volunteers that helped us to run this event in the background and gave me some prompt questions, moderated the chat, etc. We really, really appreciate your help. So I wish everyone in the PST time zone a good night, and everyone in the Sydney time zone a very good rest of the day. See you soon.